drinking beer and partying on a hot summer evening in Chicago. But take a closer look, because this isn't Chicago. This is Qingdao, China, a major resort city on the Yellow Sea, directly west of South Korea, with a population of over 7.5 million. And by the way, that's a medium-sized city by Chinese standards. I'm convinced this stunningly beautiful city with a European flavor will soon be a must-visit destination for American tourists.
Hello, I'm WGN-TV reporter and anchor Nancy Liu.
The man is facing drunk driving charges.
Police are hoping a new composite...
And while I've worked all over America and the world, I'm a Chicagoan now, but I was born in Hong Kong and came to the U.S. as a small child. When Chicago resident Helen Yang invited me to accompany her on a 10-day trip back to her hometown of Qingdao, I jumped at the opportunity. During the next half hour, you can join me on that trip and experience what many call the Asian Riviera.
All right, I'm all packed. More techie stuff than clothes. Said my goodbyes to my parents, who will watch over my family while I'm gone. Checked in, ready to endure the full body scan, and I'm about to board a direct flight from Chicago to Beijing. It's been 4 years since I last visited Asia, so I'm excited, and I've already begun my Qingdao blog. As a journalist, I took instantly to blogging, and I'm easy to find. Just Google Big Tiny World. After our 13-hour flight, we arrived in Beijing and caught another flight for a shorter trip to Qingdao. From the air, I can already see it's a beautiful city. And it's easy to understand why it's also called the Switzerland of Asia. Checking into my hotel was a breeze, and not because I speak Cantonese, which is pretty useless in this part of China where everyone speaks Mandarin. No, it was easy because so many Chinese speak English. The Intercontinental Hotel is very nice, upscale, and my room was quite comfortable. The hotel was built to house athletes for the 2008 Olympics. More on that later. But Qingdao, like most big cities, has accommodations for every budget. I was way too keyed up to sleep, so I went out to explore, minus the Chinese video crew. I'd be meeting up with them tomorrow. Here's a quick look at the unique food and signs I captured on day one with my camera. If some of the signs amuse you, it's because sometimes things get lost in translation. The next day, the crew guys arrived and we got busy. One of the first things you notice in this city is the German influence. It's everywhere. Especially at the German-built International Club, a popular hangout for students. There aren't many Americans in Qingdao yet, so I was happy to find a couple and get their impressions.
Qingdao is a place where you can see history. You can see the German influence, you can see Europe, but you can also see China.
The road that we are currently on right now, which is called Xianggang Lu, it's actually in German called Kaiser Wilhelm Road. This should give you an idea of how much German influence is here in this town.
With the brats and the beer, you'd almost forget you're in China while hanging out here. 谢谢你, if not for the Chinese waitstaff. There's good reason for all the German influence. Qingdao was just a fishing village in 1897 when German troops stormed in and took it over in retaliation for 2 German missionaries killed elsewhere in China. But they also understood its strategic military importance. It was a deep water port that never freezes. The German occupation ended in 1914 when Japanese and British troops surrounded them and forced a surrender. But the Germans had left much behind. Let's start with a massive steel military bunker called Lookout Tower on Qingdao Hill. As historian Li Ming explained to me, all the cement, iron, and steel required to construct this cavernous underground structure was imported from Germany. It could provide shelter for 2,000 troops, with 50 rooms, 3 levels, and 22,000 square feet of space. The mechanical periscope, pre-built then shipped from Germany, was designed to allow a 360-degree lookout and weighed over 17 tons. Ironically, this command center was never used during World War I, and it is the only intact World War I site in Asia. Now let's get to the beer. I'm talking about the German-influenced beer, better known to drinkers around the world as Qingdao. When German workers built the local railroad and other infrastructure back in the late 1890s, they naturally wanted a drink after work, so why not build a brewery too? While it's spelled differently, it's pronounced the same way the city is pronounced, Qingdao. We visited the historic brewery established by the Germans in 1903 and listened as my traveling companion and former Qingdao brewmaster Helen Yang explained a few things.
Oh, to Chinese people, Qingdao is beer. Qingdao Brewery is the #1 brewery in China.
Helen learned about Chicago in the 1990s when Qingdao sent her here to study some advanced brewing techniques at Chicago's Siebel Institute of Technology and World Brewing Academy. She never forgot our windy city and now makes it her home. The original Qingdao brewery has been completely modernized, but its history has been preserved in a museum, and a brewery tour draws hundreds of tourists every day. They're mostly Asian, and of course, German.
The brewery tour includes a trip through this drunken house where everyone feels drunk before they've had anything to drink.
Naturally, the tour ends with free beer, and everyone, including me, indulges a bit. Now, toasting is an old tradition in Shandong province, where Qingdao is located. It's usually reserved for formal dinner occasions, but people in the beer hall toast too. It can be hazardous for anyone who can't hold their liquor, and here's why. The tradition goes like this. The host makes 3 toasts within the first 10 minutes, and then the co-host makes 2. Then the guests are expected to toast the host to show their gratitude. Never raise your glass higher than the host because that would be disrespectful. The dangerous aspect is if the toast ends with a ganbei. That means bottoms up, and they expect you to chug whatever's left in your glass. It's easy to end up hammered if you're not careful. No one seems to know or care that much how this toasting drill evolved, but they believe it dates back to Confucius. Oh, and one more thing. Qingdao's version of a 6-pack to go is, well, this. And the German influence doesn't end with beer and bunkers.
So what was built by the Germans to be used as City Hall here in Qingdao, then used by the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek, and the People's Republic of China, is now being used by the local Qingdao government.
This European Gothic-style structure is the old German governor's mansion, built back in 1908. The opulent Bavarian castle was the official residence of the colonial-era German governor. Once under Chinese control, it was renamed Guest House and became important as a retreat for visiting dignitaries, VIPs, and political figures. In fact, both Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping have stayed here. The graceful lines, bold colors, and unique ornamentation make this building an architectural gem. The guest house is now a museum. And by the way, those dragons at the top with chains draped around their necks are rumored to symbolize the German control, chains, of the Chinese spirit, dragon. Every day on my trip to Qingdao, China, I'm noticing more and more similarities between this city and Chicago. And I'm not just talking about all the beer drinking. I'm also talking about the European-influenced architecture, the fact the city is on the water, and they even have an Edgewater hotel.
With such a big oceanfront playground, of course Qingdao offers all kinds of water sports, for this is the sailing city.
That didn't go unnoticed by the Olympic Committee when they were looking for the right place to hold the 2008 sailing competition. It was a proud moment for Qingdao, and they spared no expense for the opening ceremony. It was, in a word, spectacular.
Geographically blessed with many inlets and small islands, so there are 450 miles of shoreline, enough for everyone to enjoy.
And because the weather is relatively mild, water sports are almost always an option. Parasailing, windsurfing, and if you don't know what you're doing, there are people to teach you. If sailing isn't your speed, Qingdao has what was formerly a naval pier jutting out into the beautiful bay. Sound familiar, Chicagoans? Zhanxiao Pier was built in 1891 when Qingdao was still under German occupation. Today, it's a favorite spot for a stroll by visiting tourists and locals alike. At the end of the pier, there's a two-storied pavilion named Hui Lai Ko, or Ripple Diverging Pavilion. This iconic structure was built in 1930 and is seen around the world every day. Why? Because it's on the label of every Qingdao beer bottle. The pier is usually packed with vendors, food, and people feeding the hungry seagulls. And it's one of the best places to get a great view of the entire city. And speaking of great views, Xiaoyushen Park, or Little Fish Hill, is just a short distance from the pier. It's characterized by its 3 distinctive pavilions, perched high on a tree-covered hill and built in the Chinese classical style. Visitors consider it one of the top 10 scenic spots in Qingdao. Another iconic landmark is the Xiaoqingdao Lighthouse. The white marble beacon was, you guessed it, German-built in 1900 and served as an important navigation point for ships heading to and from the port. Located on Little Qingdao Isle, also known as Instrument Island, this small piece of land is stunningly beautiful, and it's not the only island just offshore.
On a nice day like this, you can see all the way over to Qingdao, a small island with a busy port, a lot of new housing, and even more beautiful beaches.
I know, this is getting a little ridiculous, but here's another Chicago parallel. Qingdao also has an aquarium, and like our shed, it was built in the 1930s, has been updated, and has kept much of its vintage appearance. And both are pioneering facilities with many firsts. As one of China's largest seaports, Qingdao handles millions of tons of freight. It's also the headquarters for the Chinese North Sea Fleet and offers passenger service to many points of interest around the Yellow Sea. I've spent most of my time on this trip to China exploring sites in the city of Qingdao. Today, though, I'm very excited because we're headed out of the city and up to the mountains to a special place called Laoshan.
Laoshan is only an hour's drive outside Qingdao, and yet it feels like a world away. Be ready for a healthy walk, though, which is worth it to see the crystal clear mountain waters.
Laoshan, the birthplace of Taoism, was once populated by thousands of Taoist nuns and monks. Taoism emphasizes compassion, moderation, humility, and harmony with nature and the universe. Laoshan is also famous as the only mountain in China to reach the sea, and it seemingly rises from the water. It is said to be the home of supernatural spirits because many centuries ago, Emperor Qin Shi Huang came here to visit so-called supernatural beings. People still say the spring water produced here can cure chronic diseases, and it's also a vital ingredient for Qingdao beer. The place does have a sacred, spiritual feel about it, with its oddly shaped rocks, ancient trees, and of course those bubbling, misting waters. This peaceful spot is a must-see for anyone visiting Qingdao. On the way back to the city, we had a chance to stop at China's first European-style winery, located in the fields at the base of Laoshan. This area has long been revered for its apple orchards, but it's gaining a reputation now for the Chardonnay, Rieslings, and Reds produced by Huadong Winery. I was raised near California wine country, the Napa Valley, and I immediately felt at home here. The story of this vineyard is remarkable. Michael Perry, an English wine merchant from Hong Kong, imported over 40,000 vines from Europe in the mid-'80s. His plan was to establish a world-class vineyard in China. Wine was never popular here. Most felt it was too sour, so he was taking quite a risk. 1 year later, a typhoon wiped out his dream, so Perry started over. Undaunted, he struggled on with new partners. He never lived to see the success the winery is experiencing now, the awards, the booming sales. But his ashes are buried on the site, so maybe he knows. In fact, things are so good, Huadong wine is often sold out, and they're unable to fill all the orders. I suppose that's to be expected as the Chinese lifestyle changes. With personal incomes increasing and consumer tastes following, the future is bright in what could become the world's largest wine market. The Chinese already brew 15 million tons of beer, so imagine how much wine could be consumed. I'm going to have to get a drink and think that one over. The next day, we visit another spiritual destination, and a unique one too, for China that is. We were allowed to shoot inside Qingdao's St. Michael's Catholic Cathedral. Believe it or not, there are thousands of Catholics in this area, but religion is still a very sensitive topic to the Chinese government. That's why even our local crew had never filmed inside this cathedral. Construction began in 1931 by the German Catholic Missionary Society and was halted in 1933 when Adolf Hitler came to power. He prohibited the transfer of money overseas, so the diocese was forced to independently complete construction, requiring a number of cost-effective design changes. But the church is still beautiful. Hitler wasn't the only trouble looming for St. Michael's. When the Japanese occupied Qingdao in 1942, they slapped a sign on the front door reading, "Under management of the Japanese Army." Things returned to normal when the Chinese regained control. Then came the Cultural Revolution, and St. Michael's was defaced by the Red Guard. The enormous pipe organ was destroyed, and 2 rooftop crosses were removed. Eventually, the Chinese government funded a massive restoration, and the cathedral was reopened for services in 1981. Today, services are held for both Chinese and Korean Catholics living here. I've only got a couple of days left in Qingdao, and there are so many more things to explore, so let's start with the shopping. Like any major modern U.S. city, the high-end stores are all here. Hermes, Gucci, Louis Vuitton. But their own stores are far more interesting, offering unique, very Chinese merchandise. Qingdao is also a foodie's paradise. The variety of restaurants, eateries, and food courts is mind-boggling. I've also noticed how extraordinary the presentation and preparation is. The service is excellent too. I've never had a cup of tea poured like this, and he puts on quite a show afterwards. Speaking of shows, many of the places we visited provided entertainment along with our meal. And if you love seafood, remember, Qingdao is a seaport, and fresh fish is everywhere. I'm the mother of two, and meeting the kids over here has made me a bit homesick. But it's also made me realize it's hard to tell Chinese and American kids apart these days based on their behavior. Chinese kids now carry themselves with what can only be called an American swagger. Don't get me wrong, the old regimentation and discipline are still here too, as evidenced when we visited the Qingdao Youth Sailing Camp. It was the opening day ceremony for a new class of young people learning the basics of sailing from world-class professionals. Qingdao wants to keep that brand, the sailing city, alive and well, and this camp, founded in 2006, helps to do that by attracting thousands of young people to the sport. I think we've come full circle on this trip as I spend my last night at the Qingdao Beer Festival, the largest beer festival in Asia. The event begins in the second week of August and lasts for 2 weeks. The grand opening ceremony is spectacular, followed by beer tasting, plenty of food, evening entertainment, drinking competitions, and even fireworks blowing out of a giant beer keg. What more could you want? The hometown of the largest brewery in Asia deserves an event of this magnitude, and I, forgive me, drank it all in.
Well, I'm back here in the Windy City, sweet home Chicago, but I want to thank my travel companion, Helen Yang, my crew, and the incredible people of Qingdao, China. 谢谢你. And thank you for watching this episode of Big Tiny World.